thank you for attending the latest in a series of public events in 2021 by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security here at George Mason University. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason, and we are very proud to host the Hayden Center. The Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael Hayden, who has been on our faculty for the past 11 years. Someone on Twitter asked General Hayden recently his current status, and he replied, retired. Just to be clear, in retirement, he has written 2 national best-selling books, been a national security analyst on CNN, lectured around the world, and among many other ventures, founded our Hayden Center, and he's been a frequent moderator, panelist, and participant on our many programs over the past several years. We are fortunate to have many leading scholars and practitioner teachers in our International Security Studies Master's Degree program. Professor Ellen Lapson is the program director. She's done a terrific job in building it into one of the most highly ranked in the country. And recently, we have added to our teaching capacity 2 of the 3 persons on tonight's program, Andrew McCabe, the former deputy director of the FBI, and David Priest, PhD in political science and COO of Lawfare, as well as a longtime intelligence analyst at White House intelligence briefer. And also Ronald Marks, longtime CIA officer and staff member on the Hill. Now tonight we have over 550 persons signed up from around the country and even internationally. Those who registered come from 38 states and the District of Columbia, 27 different colleges and universities in the United States and abroad, and 17 different countries and every continent except, yet again, Antarctica. We haven't quite cracked that one yet. I especially would like to welcome, by the way, the prospective students from high schools throughout the Commonwealth and around the nation. Thank you for attending. We look forward to hopefully meeting you in person at George Mason University next year. And now I would like to welcome tonight's special event by having Larry Pfeiffer, the director of the Hayden Center, introduce our panel. Larry.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. I'd like to reiterate Mark's special welcome to those students, particularly those who've been recently admitted to George Mason University and the Schar School. I think you come here to the school, you're going to find it a really exciting place to both study and live. The Hayden Center, for those who don't know, in a nutshell, we're here to demystify intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers. We do that largely through a series of events like this one. In the before times, we'd do them in person at large venues. We'd have cocktails, we'd have food. We're hoping in the fall, perhaps, or the winter, we'll be able to begin to do that again. In the meantime, we've been conducting them virtually. We're very active on social media. You can find the Hayden Center on Twitter, on Facebook, LinkedIn. All of these events that we do are recorded and stored on our Hayden Center YouTube channel. So if you're interested in seeing some of the other exciting and interesting and prominent guests we've had, just take an afternoon stroll through our YouTube channel. I think you'll find an event or 2 you'll enjoy. Our recording tonight's event for use on YouTube and social media. We're going to be entertaining questions from the audience. So go ahead and begin sending your questions in now. We're going to do the best to address as many questions as we can, but our experience is we get a lot more questions than we ever have time to answer. So we will do the best we can. Use the question and answer tool if you are watching us on Zoom. Don't use the chat function. Use the Q&A tool. You can use the chat function if you want to talk amongst yourselves, but the Q&A tool is for questions. If you're on YouTube, use the chat function. We'll be perusing that and making sure your questions get fed into the mill as well. Keep your questions brief. Please make it a question. There is an option to be anonymous. If you don't want us to mention your name over this broadcast, please indicate you want anonymity. If however you are proud of your name and your affiliation, please let us know that as well. On behalf of General Hayden, I want to welcome you here. General Hayden is not participating tonight in an active speaking capacity, but he is out there in the audience. If we were in a large auditorium, this is the point when he would stand up and turn and wave, and you would all applaud feverishly for him. So we don't have time for that tonight, but I did want to mention that General Hayden finds tonight's topic to be one of the most important topics we can be talking about today. He, for the last several years, when asked the question, what's the biggest threat to American national security? His answer has routinely been us. We, the American people, are the greatest threat to our own national security today. And that is because we as a nation have found ourselves in a situation where we're unable to share a view of what is truth and what is facts. And that is driving people into polarized camps. And ultimately that has led to violence, like the violence we've seen around the nation, and the violence that we saw in particular on January 6th at the US Capitol. We have recently seen DHS, Department of Justice, and the Director of National Intelligence publish an unprecedented joint statement noting that domestic violent extremists pose an elevated threat to our homeland this year. And of those extremist groups, it's the racially or ethnically motivated groups that pose the gravest threat. This follows earlier statements that domestic violent extremists are the greatest terrorist threat inside the United States. It's not foreign terrorists. It's not Islamic extremists inspired from abroad. Here at the Schar School, Ellen Leipson, who Mark mentioned, she leads the Center for Security Policy Studies. They did a 2-day workshop that examined this problem, looked at the causes, looked at potential solutions. We benefit tonight from the work that was done at those workshops, and that will, at least in part, informed David's approach tonight as we move forward. By way of introductions, we've got a great group here tonight. We have Elizabeth Newman. Elizabeth Newman, many of you know her from watching cable news television and public television news as well. But she has spent most of the last 20 years working in this area. Her most recent government position from 2018 to 2020, she was Assistant Secretary for Threat Prevention and Security Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. She actually left her position out of concern that domestic right-wing extremism was not only not getting the appropriate attention, but was perhaps even being fueled by actions of the president and the administration. Before that, she served at Homeland Security as a Deputy Chief of Staff. She worked at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on information sharing and counterterrorism programs. She was a founding member in the early part of the last decade of the White House's Homeland Security Council and worked in the Domestic Counterterrorism Directorate. Today, she co-directs the Republican Accountability Project that's working to hold accountable those who would spread lies and misinformation about the 2020 presidential election. Andrew McCabe, he is known to most of you as the former Deputy Director of the FBI from 2016 to 2018, and for several months in 2017, following the firing of Director Comey, was the acting Director of the FBI. He served previously in leadership positions at the FBI in counterterrorism, national security, and at the Washington Field Office. He began his time at the FBI, interestingly, as a member of the FBI SWAT team, and has interesting stories to tell about that. Today, many of you see Andrew on the television. He is a contributor at CNN. Some of you may have read his book. Those who haven't may want to take a look at his book, The Threat: How the FBI Protects America in the Age of Terror and Trump, published in 2019. He joined the Schar School faculty last fall, is in the middle of teaching a class right now. So if you're interested in hearing from Andrew in an academic setting, come to the Schar School. He also serves as a senior fellow to the Schar School. David Priest moderating. He's a former CIA analyst and briefer. As Mark mentioned, he was a PDB presidential daily briefer to FBI Director Mueller, Attorney General Ashcroft, and even at times at the White House. He is also an author. He has written the seminal book on the President's Daily Brief called The President's Book of Secrets. He has also more recently written a book about how to get rid of a president, History's Guide to Removing Unpopular, Unable, or Unfit Chief Executives. Today, he is the Chief Operating Officer at the Lawfare Institute, which oversees activities at Lawfare, which publishes on the internet and holds podcasts and live webinars as well. He's a frequent commentator on national security issues and on the presidency, on cable and public television news and radio. And he's a senior fellow here at the Hayden Center, and beginning in the fall, will be teaching at the Schar School as well. He is developing courses on the national security and the presidency and intelligence analysis. And with that long-winded introduction, I will now turn it over to David to get to what you're paying to be here for. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Mark, for the introduction. Andy, Elizabeth, here we find ourselves together again. It's a pleasure to be talking to you, but I'm getting sick of the circumstances under which we have these conversations. Eventually, I'd like to have a chat with you about puppies or just something a little more cheerful than this, but these are the times we are in, and we're grateful for your experience and insight as we talk about these issues. So, Elizabeth, let's start by going back a few years. Some people in the audience may remember this episode, but I fear many may not, but it actually sets the stage well for what we're going through now. Back in 2009, I believe it was, the Department of Homeland Security issued to law enforcement a bulletin on right-wing extremism. And included within that was a remark that returning veterans from America's wars overseas could be at risk of radicalization. And I'm wondering if you can walk us through what happened with that report and the stage that that whole episode did set for how we approached domestic terrorism within the Department of Homeland Security up until recently.
Thanks, David, for having me, for inviting me to this conversation. It's a huge honor to be on the stage with both of you. And thank you to General Hayden for facilitating and making these things possible. I worked for him for a little bit back in the ODNI days. So 2009, this bulletin gets written. Arguably, there were some edits that could have been made to make it a better product. There were reports that some concerns had been raised by during the review process by the Civil Liberties Office, that maybe those were not heeded. And so, we can start by acknowledging that the product could have been improved. That said, some of the ways that it characterized certain aspects of potentially military being recruited by anti-government extremist organizations, it set off alarm bells by first, I want to say it was Alex Jones's InfoWars. Then it got picked up by more mainstream conservative talk shows like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh. And by the time you get to something that mainstream in conservative circles, that is it's just it's hugely political. So you had members of Congress beating up on the Obama administration. This is their first year in office. They're trying to figure out how to they're focusing on healthcare. They're focusing on other issues. And the decision was made to just rescind the product. And that I was not there at the time to know all the conversations, but the impact of that was, rather than editing it and reissuing it to correct the concerns that had been raised, the impact was not only to effectively render the drafter, the writer, the analyst's career shortened, it sent a chilling effect. It sent this message, probably unintentionally, but nevertheless sent the message that you can't touch segments of our society that have a constituency, that are a strong constituency for either party. So consequently, that meant your analysts, everybody wants to promote their, advance in their career. You're not going to touch the thing that might get your hand slapped or might ruin your career. I was not working at DHS at the time, so I can't tell you exactly all of the iterations. I'm sure there's more to the story. I come back to government in 2017, and what I now know is that there was a trend line of increasing hate crimes and increasing concerning behavior among what we would call domestic extremist organizations. But we weren't getting any of that in our intel briefings. There were a handful of individuals in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at DHS that were technically responsible for any domestic terrorism type of issues. But it was my impression that they didn't spend a lot of time on those issues, they wouldn't be, maybe I'll draw a parallel. In the intelligence community, if you're sitting at the CIA and your focus is in an ISIS branch, your specialty is probably down to a regional level. It might be a particular, following a particular branch of something. It is heavily specialized, and there are a lot of people in the intelligence community that it can allow the U.S. government to be heavily specialized and understanding all of the nuances. So if something changes and a policymaker comes to you and says, "Tell me what this means. Is this different than what was happening 2 years ago?" You have a number of experts that have been looking at this for quite some time who can all give their opinions and formalize an assessment as to whether this is significant or not. What I found when we came to DHS is that expertise was not there. So they couldn't raise flags for us that something has changed in our environment and we need to be paying more attention to it.
So that's one key element here, is talking about that expertise within the United States government to address this issue. And we will be coming back to that. But Andy, I'd like to hit the other side of that, which is, what is it we're even talking about? Let's define domestic terrorism. When you were rising into executive positions at the FBI and you were looking at domestic terrorism as a topic set, what did you include within that? What did you exclude from that? And how do existing laws cover what you call domestic terrorism already so that you can conduct criminal investigations against it?
Sure. So just to give you a little bit of background on that, and this is where I think the public gets confused with the way that the FBI approaches these investigations. So in the FBI, anyone, any group or any individual who is a member of a foreign terrorist organization or is inspired by a foreign terrorist organization or a follower of a foreign terrorist organization is considered international terrorism wherever they're located. So we might be investigating an American who's gone to Syria to join ISIS, or you might be investigating someone who we refer to as like a lone wolf, inspired by ISIS, lives here somewhere in the continental United States. That person, even though they're here, is still, for FBI reasons, an international terrorist subject of investigation. The domestic terrorist investigations are handled also in the counterterrorism division, but by a different group of people. Domestic terrorism, and from the FBI's purview, has typically been broken down into about 4 major categories. You have racially motivated extremist groups. You have anti-government extremist groups. You have anti-abortion extremist groups and individuals. And then you have environmental extremists.
And to be clear, Andy, those anti-government extremists in that second category you mentioned, that is ideologically neutral. So that spans the spectrum, right wing, left wing.
That's right. All these groups are somewhat ideologically neutral, right? So you have in that anti-government group, you could have sovereign citizens who just object to the authority of the federal government and refuse to pay taxes or put license plates on their cars, things like that. Or you can have militia groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3 Percenters, who are more like actively armed and presenting some sort of armed challenge to the authority of the government. Or you could have individuals and groups that consider themselves part of the Antifa movement, which of course started as an anti-fascist movement, but then eventually morphed into just kind of opposing everything. So they're all kind of included in that category of anti-government groups. The reason for the split between domestic terrorism and international terrorism is founded in law. So on the international terrorist side, because it is a federal crime to join or support a designated foreign terrorist group, you have a very different set of tools, investigative tools that you can work with. Those investigations are classified. They are handled as national security investigations. There's a high degree of cooperation with the intelligence community. There's a high degree of cooperation with intelligence agencies around the world. You have access to classified investigative techniques like electronic surveillance pursued under the FISA statute, things of that nature. On the domestic side, because by definition, domestic terrorism is investigating people who are here in the United States, likely Americans, and acting out of some sort of political or ideological basis, you have the much greater concerns about First Amendment issues. So the basis of domestic terrorism investigations starts with a violation of criminal law. You have to have you have to be able to predicate those cases or begin those investigations with information that indicates that a federal criminal law is being violated. And that's likely going to be a violent crime offense. Domestic terrorism is defined in federal statute. It is not criminalized, but it is defined in 18 USC 2331 as primarily two things. It has to be an act dangerous to human life. So there's your federal violent crime, essentially. And it has to be committed to intimidate or coerce a civilian population or to influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion. So it is that combination of violent crime, which is a violation of federal criminal law, with the intent to intimidate and pursue some sort of ideology or political purpose through coercion.
Thank you. That's really puts the picture out there well for us. And is it fair to say that the material support statute against supporting foreign terrorist organization, that there is no direct parallel for that for domestic organizations that could espouse violence against the US government?
That's right. That's exactly right. Because think about it, in the international side, terrorist organizations are designated terrorist organizations by the State Departments, and then it is illegal to support or join or fight with those organizations. It's material support to terrorism. It's one of our most fundamental anti-terrorism statutes. On the domestic side, it is not illegal to join a group that holds racist or anti-government sentiment. It is not illegal to be a racist and to express racist beliefs and racist objectives or anti-government objectives or extremist environmental objectives. It only becomes illegal. Those activities are all protected by the First Amendment. It only becomes illegal when you are committing a federal crime. For instance, constructing a weapon of mass destruction. If you're setting a bomb because you're a racist and you want to attack, you want to attack a Black church in Mississippi, that is a federal crime to construct a weapon of mass destruction. So there has to be that fundamental criminal predicate to get past the idea of just investigating people for their First Amendment protected political speech.
And I suspect that's not the last time tonight we'll talk about this balance between constitutionally protected rights and the security elements in a domestic extremism world. Back to you, Elizabeth. Back in late January, I believe it was, DHS issued an unprecedented National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin that we talked about on the Lawfare podcast about domestic violent extremists. And it was remarkable because it didn't even mention foreign terrorism explicitly. It was solely about domestic violent extremists. Frankly, the kind of report that I think you wanted to push some momentum towards when you were still there. Why was this bulletin important, and what example does it set for addressing domestic violent extremism as this year goes on?
So the NTAS, just to orient everybody, you might remember post like the Department of Homeland Security standing up and Tom Ridge getting on TV and saying we were at orange alert. It replaced the color coded system that people love to beat up on. And the idea was that there would be 3 levels of warning, and they would issue a 1-page document, which when you read through the one that was just issued, pretty much all of them look and feel this way. It's like very dense, very analytic, wordsmithed, and quite frankly, we always struggled with how do you make this accessible to the public in a way that it helps them, because it really is designed to be a public communication as opposed to what DHS and FBI do every day, which is issue bulletins and threat analysis for law enforcement partners or other security partners at an FOUO level, for official use only level. This is intentionally designed to be a public communication. And it's not just kind of a tool that you get to use if you want to. The law is written in such a way that it's kind of a directive that if there is a threat, the department is supposed to warn the public. The challenge, of course, is that most threats are not specific, credible, to the level that I think Hollywood makes us think that they are. Most of them are hazy pictures, not exactly sure who, not exactly sure where, but the environment shifted. We picked up a tip. We think the person's credible, but we don't know. It's like much like in foreign intelligence, you're piecing together a puzzle, and it's very rare that we have enough details. And by the way, if we did, the FBI would be disrupting it, right? So it's the purpose of issuing these bulletins is not necessarily to say we think there's going to be a bombing in New York City this weekend. If we had that kind of information, that would be helpful, because then we would be that specific. But it's usually what we saw in January. You mentioned that I was a little frustrated that was not done earlier. Certainly, the change of administrations has a lot to do with this. At DHS, there was a lack of people left in the department that knew. There were like two guys that kind of know how the system is supposed to work and what you have to do to actually get one of these things out the door. And certainly the political appointees were not very interested in focusing on that effort. And from what we can tell, leading into January 6th, the folks at DHS, there might have been a handful of people aware that the chatter was maybe of concern, but it was not moving the way that we would expect the department to operate. Normally, you would have a meeting of counterterrorism officials. You would pick up the phone and call your counterparts at the FBI. And what are you seeing? Do we think we should say something to the public? It sounds like none of that really happened to the level that it probably should have. So in an ideal scenario, if you were to do it over again, probably last summer, there was enough of a justification for the department to at least have had the conversation that we needed to issue an in-task bulletin. It is very possible that in those conversations, especially with the analytic community, they may have said, like, there's not enough here. It's too speculative. But certainly by the time you get to post-election period and the things that we were seeing online, I'm not in the government, so I don't know what they were seeing from an investigative standpoint. But just the open source dialogue alone was very indicative that we were in an extremely tense environment. A number of people had asserted that they were looking for violence. So you could have argued that it should have been issued in November or December. The fact that we finally got it in late January, that's still good. Good on, I think it was like within a week of the Biden administration coming into office. And it was not nearly as comprehensive as what we got this last week in the IC assessment about domestic violent extremists. But I didn't expect too much detail because they'd only been in office for a week. So the other probably the notable thing about these assessments, this was the third that has been issued since this new system has been created. It was originally the first bulletin issued was about ISIS shortly after the attack in Paris at the Bataclan Theater, just basically saying we need to be cautious that similar attacks that occurred in France may occur here in the United States with little to no notice. That bulletin was reissued every 6 months until 2019. And the way the bulletins work is they have an expiration date, so you can let them naturally expire or you can reissue them. So every 6 months or another time period that the government can set. The next one was last January, a year ago, with the killing of Soleimani. One was issued that we were concerned that there might be sleeper cells activated or other retaliatory measures, including cyber related measures. So that was issued. It was, I think, re-upped once and it expired in March. So it's the third in about 6-7 years since this system has existed that's in and of itself is significant. And then I would say the last significance is just the content itself. In the 20 years that we have been doing counterterrorism, we have never come right out and been this direct about the fact that the threat is now here. It is within. It is not over there.
Right. Let's explore this a little. You raise a really interesting issue about the Department of Homeland Security, perhaps overall, but certainly particular units within it, not having the institutional experience and the depth to adapt to these changing circumstances easily. And I think that was also highlighted last year by the Office of Intelligence and Analysis collecting intelligence and reporting out as intelligence the tweets of US reporters talking about the Department of Homeland Security. It's awkward when you have people on a panel from two agencies and departments to compare and contrast things going on there. So let's compare and contrast DHS and FBI. Andy, walk us through, because of the longer institutional history and frankly, some of the galactic errors that were made in the FBI's past regarding domestic security and civil liberties. Walk us through how FBI special agents in the modern era are trained to respect and not intrude on First Amendment protected activity while actually using proper predicates to investigate and hopefully prevent crimes. What is it that an average FBI agent is educated about, and how is that done to make this gray area a little bit easier to navigate?
Well, I mean, like everything with FBI agents, it starts at Quantico with investigative training and legal training that outlines the constitutional boundaries that we work within, and of course that those lessons go with you no matter where you go in the FBI, whether you're doing counterintelligence work or counterterrorism work or criminal work or what have you. The way you apply them is very different depending on the circumstances you're in. So for domestic terrorism investigators, I think they probably have as high, if not the highest sense of awareness of those boundaries of where lawfully predicated investigations begin and end, and where people's First Amendment protected rights begin and end, because it is such a it's really a minefield that domestic terrorism investigators and analysts have to tread in a way that really nobody else does, because by definition, to some extent, you are investigating people because of the political or the ideological issues they're pursuing and talking about. So there is some degree of First Amendment expression there, and we cannot conduct any investigative activity predicated on First Amendment protected speech alone. However, when you combine that First Amendment protected speech with a plan to, let's say, kidnap a governor of a Midwestern state, that's the point at which you have to really put a very thorough and complicated criminal investigation in motion. Now, during the course of that investigation, you will not have access to things like FISA monitoring for electronic surveillance, and you won't be able to go to your partners at the CIA or the NSA to probe what intelligence they might have on your subject, because they don't have that. They don't conduct that sort of intelligence collection on Americans. So it's, you were working with those criminal tools that all FBI agents are familiar with. If you think you need to conduct electronic surveillance, that is through a criminal Title III warrant that you pursue through your local U.S. Attorney's Office and in your local federal court. So there is a very tight set of restrictions around FBI agents who do this work. I think that regimen has proven itself to be durable and effective. I think that side of the FBI's investigative work on domestic terrorism, or DT as we call it, is good, but there is always this tension between what we've just been talking about, the tactical side of the investigations, and the strategic understanding and awareness of the threat. And, our international terrorism investigators have a huge advantage in developing that strategic understanding of the threat today and where it's going in the future, because they can rely on all of these classified intelligence tools and partnerships with intel agencies and things of that nature. The domestic terrorism investigators don't. You are working a criminal case. And so you're trying to develop informants, and you're trying to gain access to communications through Title III warrants, which only last for 30 days and are very rigorously kind of monitored and taken down quickly. So it is hard to develop that broader strategic understanding of the threat that would help people like Elizabeth and her former colleagues at DHS when they're putting together this consumable, articulation of how should this country think about the threat posed by domestic extremists. So
Andy,
it's
you
challenging.
said something in there. I think I want to clarify. You talked about not being able to talk to colleagues at CIA and use FISA collection in an average case like this. But there are cases in which you probably can, right? Because on the one hand, let's lay out two hypotheticals. You've got a hypothetical of we'll call them a left-wing group, let's say anti-globalization protesters back from 20 years ago, who before 9/11 were being seen as one of the more significant threats to security because they were going to events like the World Bank and IMF meetings, to summits of international leaders, and they were instigating violence. And that was cross-border. That is, you had international teams of anti-globalists who were going everywhere from Seattle, perhaps the most famous one in the United States, to Genoa in Italy, where you had a death resulting from it. And in a case like that, there are international connections that can be investigated, I would think, as part of an investigation. And then, of course, you could look at the other side and say, well, what about right-wing extremism, like the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol? And were there, in fact, any foreign supporters of that, whether from Russia or elsewhere? Are you saying that the FBI can't investigate that if they think there is a likely foreign connection?
No, they certainly can investigate it. Those foreign connections, which actually, if you read the recent domestic violent extremism threat piece, there you go. We all have it. Everybody has it. I think every family's got
We all have it highlighted. That's what we do.
Exactly. So the connections to foreign groups are actually called out in this piece. And so there's no question that the FBI is going to run down those connections. And they'll do that by coordinating with foreign partners and potentially intelligence community partners. But in the same way that you would if you have an American who goes overseas to affiliate with ISIS, right? So that's an IT case, but it's still an American. So that investigation of the American needs to be done by the FBI. Yeah. But those normal rules of intelligence coordination, once you have an overseas element, would apply in either context. Okay. If you were trying to conduct electronic surveillance of an American who is coordinating with a foreign terrorist group, you would pursue that through FISA in the way you would with any international terrorism case.
Mm-hmm. Elizabeth, let's hit a different aspect of this. What's the distinction between targeted violence and domestic terrorism? I mean, what is the difference there, and why does it matter, especially for DHS equities?
Well, I think sadly we may have seen two examples in the last week. Investigations aren't done yet, so we don't know. But that was actually why we, when we were rebooting, if you will, some of the countering violent extremism programs and created the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, we brought targeted violence in because we were designing prevention capabilities that were somewhat ideologically neutral. So it didn't matter if you were inspired by ISIS, or in the case of Las Vegas, we don't know the motivation. It does not it was never found to be terrorism. In the eyes of most that were there, it was terrifying, and we want to make sure it never happens again, right? So that the prevention side of things, when you're preventing something or responding to something, the functions that you perform are mostly ideologically neutral. So we brought targeted violence in. So definitionally speaking, targeted violence, we at DHS excluded domestic violence in the government structure of dealing with what things that are considered domestic violence. That tends to be an HHS responsibility, along with the Department of Justice, in terms of grant funds, and usually is dealt with at a local or state level in terms of policing. Likewise, gang violence, we did not include that in the definition, mainly because there are other parts of the government, DOJ, that has a number of programs that already address gang violence. So we were thinking more about the types of mass attacks, usually with a gun, that might not necessarily have a terrorist ideology. Terrorism is inherently tied to the idea of achieving a political aim through violence. You're trying to coerce society, coerce your government to do something through violence. Just because you are mentally unstable or fighting your own demons, you decide to go take a gun and shoot a bunch of people, not necessarily politically motivated. That's not terrorism by definition, by statutory definition, but it is a form of targeted violence that sadly has become very prevalent in our society. And so that's why we came up with the monikers. There's actually a requirement in the strategic framework that we issued in September 2019. It's the DHS Strategic Framework for Countering Terrorism and Targeted Violence. It actually requires DHS to go and better describe targeted violence. There's a definition in that document, but it acknowledges that it's fairly broad, and we probably need to hone in and get a little more specific.
Yeah, thank you. All of this brings up, whether it's the issues of how to define things and authorities. You've already mentioned different elements, and DOJ handle some of this, but there's a lot of talk again about something that I thought we put to rest about 19 years ago. I remember talking with Director Mueller explicitly about this. So Andy, I'll put you on the spot on this very question. Should we just have a domestic intelligence service separated from the FBI?
No. Next question.
That's about where Bob Mueller got to.
Yeah, I was
he had to
channeling
give an
my
explanation
inner
to
Mueller.
Congress.
I don't think that helps. Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah? Okay, good. I don't think that helps. The question about an American MI5, if you will, modeling a domestic intelligence organization along the lines of the way the Brits do it, came up through some very legitimate concerns after 9/11 that the intelligence collection side domestically had failed, right? This plot had brewed in our midst. We had, members of this foreign terrorist organization here who were able to hide in plain sight, and there were clear mistakes made and kind of holes in our intelligence collection network here domestically. I think the 9/11 Commission recommended against that. I know Director Mueller spent a lot of time working to kind of hold that off. And the theory was then that, or Director Mueller's theory was, we are stronger because we have an organization that does both. And if you look at places like the UK or Canada, the Canadian example, they suffer from a failure of coordination between that purely domestic intelligence organization and then the law enforcement organizations that ultimately have to take action against these threats. A lot gets kind of lost in the translation between those two. We don't have those problems with the FBI because we do both. And what we needed to do is do it better internally. We needed to be better, develop a better, more professional, more capable analytical cadre, which we did. We needed to be more coordinated internally. We needed to be led by our intelligence, not by our habits and our history. So those are all things that the FBI really tackled in the decade after 9/11. I don't think a domestic intelligence agency helps you on the DT question. And it's really because of that sensitivity. There's always been a concern among Americans about a domestic intelligence agency, right? It raises all kinds of issues about privacy violations and violations of civil rights and things like that. Those concerns are even more heightened in the area of domestic terrorism because of the inherently political nature of some of the work. And so I think that the American MI5 as a solution is even worse in the context of domestic terrorism than it was in the aftermath of 9/11.
Yeah, we do have, of course, an organization apart from DHS itself that we did not have at the time that discussion was going on, and that is the National Counterterrorism Center, or NCTC.
That's right.
Both of you worked closely with during your time in government. I'll start with you, Elizabeth, but Andy, chime in on this as well. Mm-hmm. Here you have an organization which has something that no one else in the U.S. national security community does, which is analysts who routinely have both foreign intelligence systems and FBI reporting side by side at their desk that they incorporate in their assessments, their analysis, and their disseminated reports about terrorism issues. Should NCTC authorities simply be widened to allow them to devote more effort to domestic violent extremism that does not have a foreign connection? Elizabeth, you first.
I would certainly say that that's one solution to the challenge that we faced. And I fully agree with what Andy was saying. I don't think we need a domestic intelligence agency for a whole host of reasons, including it would create more radicalization in the process. So need to recognize our country has some pretty strong opinions about those sorts of things. I don't think it'd be helpful. But the challenge that I faced in 2017, we started the conversation around this lack of strategic understanding of the threat. It still persists. It's getting a little better. As I was leaving, more products were coming out that were a little bit more at that strategic level. I think some of it can be fixed if the future Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis at DHS chose to invest in creating an analytic cadre that actually studied the problem. Quite frankly, there's any number of open source resources that you don't necessarily need. I mean, don't get me wrong, you of course want access to FBI data, but you could learn a lot by just reading history books and researchers that have studied these violent extremist groups. And if I mean, take a flashback, if 5 years ago, somebody had said, I want to set aside 5 or 10 people and they just need to become experts in this, by 2 years in, they would have been able to say things to us that would have made us act differently. Some of the, though I am proud of the fact that we had secretaries that advocated we needed to do more about domestic terrorism. We made changes to some of our policy frameworks. We advocated in partnership with FBI and NCTC to do more in domestic terrorism. We still were kind of late to realizing that the problem was there. It really, if you talk to people on the outside, they were seeing it much earlier than we were. So I think we need to close that strategic intel gap. NCTC under Russ Travers kind of encouraged the lawyers to take a relook at as broad of an interpretation as you can of their authorities. And the lawyers came back and said that the Strategic Operational Planning Group could help us, but the intel side could not. So DSOP, to this day, is helping FBI and DHS in this effort. it would be great, or maybe one potential solution is to change the law to allow the analytic part of NCTC to help with the appropriate protocols in place.
And I would say we still have another problem on top of that, which is even if you have the strategic analysis going on, and even if you have great resources and even wider authorities, you've still got to have policymakers who are willing to hear it. And to the best of my knowledge, when briefing terrorism assessments after 9/11, we did not have any domestic political constituencies, members of Congress or members of the administration, who were disinclined to like getting reporting about Al-Qaeda because they supported Al-Qaeda. Whereas you can have with these domestic violent extremists, you can have elected members of Congress who may say they don't support the violence, but they support the ideas behind the violence. And that's a very different situation, trying to get a policymaker or a member of Congress to actually digest an assessment on a terrorism issue.
David, that's not just on the national level. We experience that on the local level.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, I'll take, for example, the FBI's work out at the wildlife refuge in Malheur a few years back. And one of the things that made that situation so challenging, it was a very volatile, heavily armed group, and we got into that standoff that went about 40 days or so. One of the things that made it tough to handle was many of the, particularly the sheriffs in some of the surrounding areas were really, I'm trying to think of a way to say this diplomatically, but really in the camp of the folks who had taken over the refuge. They felt the same way about the objections to federal land management issues, and really, so it's a minefield of politics whenever you get into really targeting some of these groups and trying to take appropriate action. And you're right, that perfect example is, there's nobody on the Hill lobbying on behalf of Al-Qaeda. They don't have a constituency. We can all agree that, name your foreign terrorist organization, they're an enemy, and we should do what we can to mitigate that threat. This is not the same situation.
Let me bring up something from the Q&A. I have a whole bunch of other questions that I'm just going to physically throw them away because we're getting so many great questions inside the Q&A function here and emailed to us as well. I'll start on this point with one from Sasha Ingber at Newsy. She asks about Michigan's new Anti-Terrorism Act as a potential model, not to go federal, but to go state by state, because the Attorney General in Michigan has actually said this allows her to bring charges that the federal law does not. Either one of you, if you're familiar with this Michigan law, is that a good role model for other states or even for federal law? And if you're not familiar with it, what is that relationship between state and federal law when it comes to some of these areas that are not addressed under current statutes?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Michigan law, so I can't comment on that. But there is, you can't overstate the significance of state and local law when you're talking about domestic terrorism. Many of the FBI's cases, investigations result in prosecution at the state level, not at the federal level, because they have better statutes that will, that address the activity more directly, or, you're predicated based on a murder or an attempted assassination or something like that. And those are all sometimes easier done on the state level. So, and I would also argue that on the intel side, you're, as in many things, you're one of your most valuable sources of intelligence collection on domestic extremist activity is from your state and local police. They are on the ground. They see it happening around them. They know their communities better than we do, better than the FBI does. And so I think those are two sides of the state picture that really need to be maybe enhanced as we go forward on this problem set.
Okay. Elizabeth, I've got one from you from the Q&A here. This is Vic Lamanuzzi, who asks a couple of great questions. He wonders how the public can help identify potential domestic extremists and then report such identifications to the government. We all remember after 9/11, the see something, say something mantra that came from DHS. Seeing something and saying something on domestic violent extremism shouldn't be that different, but it feels different. What do you suggest on this front?
Yeah, and I was reading through some of the chat questions too, and I wanted to clarify when I talked about ideological neutrality. I was talking about prevention programming, which is different than what the FBI does. The FBI is investigating, and they're also predicating their investigation on a crime, not on the ideology. But we know knowing about ideology often can help you see signs and indicators that there might be something that you need to take a closer look on. So when we look at prevention, what studies of attackers, people that have committed attacks, and we've been studying this for like 30 years now. The Secret Service has a group called the National Threat Assessment Center. The FBI has a behavioral analysis center or unit. They look at common features. They kind of basically tear through an attacker's background, and then they look for what are the commonalities across all of these attackers. And from that, social scientists and researchers can tell you, like, these are signs and indicators or behavioral indicators of somebody that might be predisposed to mobilizing to violence, or might be, and in here are pre-attack indicators. And so you're looking at the more that we know about those potential indicators earlier in the process. And one of the, we haven't talked about it today, but it's when we talk about terrorism, whether it's international or domestic, one of the features that's kind of shifted over the last 10 years is that attacks are happening faster. The flash to boom can be very quick, which makes it more difficult for law enforcement to detect and disrupt. So we were seeing people radicalized by the internet, decide to do something, and they're planning an attack and executing that attack much shorter than when we were dealing post 9/11 with an Al-Qaeda complex style of coordinated attack. So when you're looking for those behavioral indicators, this idea of prevention is that we can set up at a local level the ability to educate members of the community, particularly members of the community that might engage with at-risk individuals, vulnerable individuals more often. This is particularly important in, say, a high school setting, training teachers and coaches on signs and indicators of somebody that might be radicalizing, mobilizing to violence. You teach them the indicators. You then have some sort of intake system. Every location's a little different. Some use their police department. Some choose to have there be a stronger line between law enforcement and their prevention work. But the basic idea is that you're doing a threat assessment of the individual and then a threat management plan. You're involving social services, mental health professionals, law enforcement, because you're determining whether a criminal threshold has been reached. But in many of the cases, it's that sad story that we hear that law enforcement had heard that this person, or they had done knock and talks with a person that they were concerned about, but there was no threshold reached. There was no predicate for them to do anything. So what do we do about those individuals? And that's what a prevention capability is trying to address, is making sure we can, as the public, identify those individuals and assess them and get them help. Getting them help can be tricky. Sometimes they don't want help. And if they're a minor, it's one thing. You can get the parent to say, yes, they're going to get the help. If they're not a minor, that can be challenging. But that is what we're trying to set up. We got funded by Congress. First fiscal year was 2 years ago, FY20. We're in the second fiscal year, in the order of $20 million of grant funds. In fact, DHS just released grant funds this week for this next grant cycle. And I can't remember exactly, but I want to say around 15 million for the office. And they're in the process of placing people in the field to help our state and local partners build out this prevention capability and make sure that all of the connections that need to be there with local law enforcement, with U.S. attorneys, FBI offices are all there. This is a 5 to 10 year capability build. I mean, this is akin to what we did post 9/11 and making sure that firefighters and law enforcement had the response capability, that their comms would work in the case of a terrorist attack. It's going to take multiple years of funding. It's going to take multiple years of figuring out the right ways to do this, to make sure health information is protected, civil liberties are protected, to make sure that there isn't a gap or seam between the people that are doing this non-law enforcement activity and law enforcement, because there is probably, for some individuals, they might not be able to be helped, and it does become a law enforcement problem. So that's what we're trying to create. Now, to the question of what do you do now, that's a bit more challenging. I think in the particular moment that we're in, and we haven't talked about it yet, but we keep referencing that the DVE threat assessment, it says attacks are likely. We've already seen 2. They may or may not manifest like we just saw, where it's not particularly associated with a violent extremist organization, might not even be associated with the political ideology. But all of the signs and indicators that we're in a very tense environment, and there's going to be more violence as the pandemic wanes. We're reopening. You're going to have more mass gatherings. That's more targets. Sadly, I think we're in for a very difficult year. So what I have been encouraging is this is the time for you to reach out to any loved ones, especially if they live by themselves, or maybe they just have a personality type that they keep to themselves. Check on them, see if they're doing okay. And if they're not, get them help. I think it's particularly important for parents of young adults to check in, much like what we saw with these last 2 shooters. They were young adults, and typically family and friends, those that are closest, do see signs that something is off. So if you see something that is off and somebody that you love, don't brush it aside. Now's the time to try to find out more and see how you can help them. Empathy goes a long way to somebody that is, even if they're a very difficult person, empathizing and loving people tends to have more of an impact than arguing about ideology. That we are not very successful in de-radicalizing people when you come at them with an argument, as opposed to recognizing that whatever is behind that ideology is usually some unmet psychological need, a need for significance, a sense that they've been humiliated in some way. And so if you know somebody that needs help, there are a number of organizations out there. They're probably overwhelmed, being honest. Since January 6th, really since the election period, these organizations have been overwhelmed. But Parents for Peace, Life After Hate, and I'm blanking on the names of a few others. If in the Denver area, there is a capability that we piloted that is active. So there are certain communities that have threat management, threat assessment programs that are already set up that you might be able to take advantage of. But the other piece, the see something, say something, is really important. It could be maybe not somebody you know, but just a member of the public saying, well, that looks odd. Why did that guy walk into we had a guy in Atlanta walk into a Publix the day after an attack with multiple guns. Probably something that you want to call 911 about and get addressed right away, right? So we need to be vigilant. If you're an owner or operator of a grocery store, any sort of public gathering place, even if you haven't reopened yet, dust off your plans. Make sure you remember your active shooter drills. Make sure your employees have that kind of fresh in their mind. It's going to be a difficult year, I'm afraid.
Well, that is really useful background to understand that whole process and the fact that these programs are kicking in. I want to ask one question that came in related to this, because you ended talking about something that is a hard indicator, which is you see someone carrying an excessive amount of weaponry saying, I want to go kill people. That's a hard indicator. But you also talked about psychological factors. And that's what Dr. Oliver Morgan asks about. He notes that experiences of humiliation seem to be a central theme of the picture, especially for radicalized males that turn to domestic extremism, which points to the chain of trauma to violent activity, perhaps being stronger than any particular ideology as a spur to terrorist acts. What say you, Elizabeth? Do you think that looking for such a deep psychological indicator, something as a routine traumatic experience, perhaps in adolescence or earlier, that leads to a sense of humiliation. Is there a way of identifying that in a useful way in this context?
Yeah, I mean, look, all of the studies about this is true with international terrorism too. The underlying reasons why people join terrorist organizations or commit these attacks is usually they're trying to meet some unmet psychological need. You could experience a humiliating event in your childhood or adolescence and have other resilience factors around you that help you get through them. Christian Picciolini, who is a former skinhead and now helps people exit, he talks about them as potholes in life. And we all have them. We all have things that don't go the way that they're supposed to. It's a fallen world. Some are more severe than others. And for some, a combination of those, past traumas combined with maybe existing stressors, meaning something fresh and recent, and not having the proper resilience factors, and that's kind of I realize that's a buzzword, but attachments, like being in a loving parent-child relationship, right? Like having things that ground you even while you've had this trauma and this maybe recent stressors. So having resilience built in, and that's part of when we're looking at prevention, that's part of what we're looking at is how do you build resilience into a society? How do you build resilience factors to help society with disinformation, right? Like there are things that we're looking for way upstream from anybody even getting close to being radicalized or mobilizing to violence. And by doing that, hopefully we're shrinking the pool of the number of people that need help because they're radicalized or worse are actually mobilizing to violence and become a law enforcement challenge. But I fully support the idea, and I kind of came to the conclusion. We were being briefed by some U.S. attorneys. I want to say this was early 2019, and one of them gave the story that they had just indicted somebody who had joined initially a white supremacist group, was there for a couple of months and then left because he was frustrated that they were not violent enough. So then he went and joined ISIS, which you would think the ideologies would conflict. But what you find is that it actually, for many people, the ideology is loosely held. Now, once they're in the midst of it, they might fight you tooth and nail because they really, truly, quote unquote, believe it. But when people leave, when you talk to people that have been de-radicalized, they are able to look back and go, it was a way for me to channel my hate and my anger over these other things that had happened in my life. I didn't actually, maybe in the moment I believed it, but it wasn't really about that.
Andy, I'm going to give you an easy one after that because that's a real challenge. So this one has come up from several people. Randy Fearson asks it, Alan Adler, and others in the Q&A and chat have related to it. A concern after the attack on January 6th was about the people within the US government, perhaps within the military, within law enforcement, who may have enabled the attacks, but at a minimum, support some of the activity that occurred on January 6th, and people perhaps with top secret security clearances who are in fact part of the problem as it's defined here. How does the government identify and expunge such people from its ranks if the personnel systems that brought them in the first place did not?
Oh man, I thought that was going to be an easy question.
It's everything's easy for you, Andy, right?
No, everything's hard for me. So there's a couple of things packed in there. Maybe if I can answer by separating them out a little bit. If you're referring to reports that individual officers on the Capitol may not have, worked, resisted in some ways that you maybe think they should have. And I know there's been scattered reports of officers helping rioters get access to places and things like that. I mean, those things obviously have to be fully investigated and appropriate measures need to be taken against those folks if those claims are substantiated. That's just absolutely a dereliction of duty and misconduct at bare minimum, and those folks shouldn't really probably be a member of the Capitol Police or the MPD. So that's kind of the one thing. On the broader question of whether or not there are people in government and in law enforcement who are maybe like-minded or agree with some of the claims and the principles and the falsehoods that the rioters and the insurrectionists on January 6th were perpetuating, that's a much tougher question because it gets to the heart of political belief, right? And it's we don't want to be like purging employees out of the government because they happen to embrace political theories that are, whatever.
But you can ask for a security clearance. You're not saying that it's inappropriate to ask, are you a member of an organization seeking to overthrow the US government?
Absolutely not. That's a standard question, right? In the SF-86. And that's really where it's kind of like we were talking about earlier on the DT distinction. It comes down to conduct. So if you're a government person and you took part in the riot and the insurrection on January 6th, then you should be investigated and held accountable for that, whether that's criminally, if you violated criminal laws, or even if it's internally within your organization. If your acts were inconsistent with the values and the requirements of your organization, you should be purged. The bigger, much broader, and I think much harder question that I think the FBI and DHS and the federal government should be asking itself right now is, does January 6th show some sort of failure, fundamental failure to appreciate the threat that was posed by this specific group of people? And that, if the answer to that is yes, then there could be many different reasons for it. And I think to get to the bottom of that we need obviously a thorough and comprehensive investigation. And I think it should focus on three things. One, what did predominantly the FBI know before January 6th? What intelligence do they have? Were they collecting intelligence in the right places? Were their sources any good? Was the information that they were collecting in 56 field offices making its way to the kind of centrally managed DT structure at headquarters? How did they handle that information? So that's one thing. What did they know prior to the 6th? The second thing would be, what did they conclude based upon that? So with all that intelligence, what conclusions and assessments did they draw? And the final question is, ultimately, what did they do with that information in terms of sharing it with their partners who clearly needed it, could have used it in an effective way before the riot? So I think only by conducting an investigation like that are you going to get to that fundamental issue of, did we go into this threat with whatever indicators they saw, with whatever intelligence they had, did they fail to appreciate the distinct threat that this particular group posed on that day?
Right. Elizabeth, it's not fair for him to get the tough questions only. So I'm going to give one to you. This is from Richard Warlock. Within the anti-government category of groupings here, you've made no secret that you are a conservative coming to these issues, but putting that aside as much as you can, which is the bigger threat to the US government, Antifa or QAnon?
Oh, interesting. So let's take QAnon first. And it might be interesting to hear Andy's perspective on this. I vaguely heard about QAnon in sometime in the 2019 timeframe. There was an FBI bulletin that was put out. I remember asking my staff, do we think that they're that violent? Like, is this something to be concerned about? And they're like, I mean, it's really weird, but no, we're not seeing a mobilization to violence the way that we have seen anti-government militia or a white supremacist group, Atomwaffen, to name one, that actually makes plans and we actually have to go and disrupt. So it wasn't really until you get to 2020 and QAnon goes mainstream, and I should caveat that there had been instances before 2020 Most famously pre-QAnon, Pizzagate in 2016, where individuals had acted on, vigilante justice type of violence. They believed the conspiracy and they were going to go do something about it. But in 2020, we started seeing more of that. A lot of it kind of the type of thing that local police have to handle, not necessarily, the thing that the JTTF gets called up to go and deal with. So the biggest threat that I think QAnon faces is the disinformation aspect of it. It sucks up a lot of time and resources for the human trafficking space, because part of their conspiracies is this idea that there's a bunch of child sex trafficking going on by an evil cabal of elites. We saw them disrupt the National Human Trafficking Hotline over the summer when basically a fake story got posted on Facebook. So there is real harm that is caused. The other harm is that of just a general distrust in government. At some point in a democratic republic, if the people who are supposed to, be empowering, like the government's power is derived from the people. If the people don't trust their government, you do end up with scenarios like what happened on January 6th. Like it doesn't end
That's part
well.
of the problem, isn't it? That sowing distrust in the US government isn't inherently illegal. Acting violently against that government is. Exactly.
So, the threat of QAnon, if you will, is the long-term undermining of our democratic principles and quite frankly, our civil society. Like the fact that you have such disruption in families over QAnon, like that has a cascading effect on our society. It makes us very unhealthy. You were going to say something, Andy?
It seems more to me like a driver of radicalization and grievance and the things that, ultimately compel some people to become extremists. But it seems, at least at this point, to be less of a coherent organization that's actually, staging events and organizing people to engage in violent activity. That's how I would distinguish it from Antifa. Antifa is also it's hard to call it an organization. It's really a very loosely affiliated group of people who share some radical anti-government, anti-banking, anti-globalism, beliefs. But wherever they show up, you tend to have violence. So, and that's really what enables the FBI and other law enforcement entities to go in and investigate and try to kind of mitigate those threats. So I don't know, maybe I don't know enough about QAnon, but I'm not sure that it's evolved to that level yet, where it's like a definitive driver of violence, as it seems to be more of a driver of nonsense, really, that compels people to believe insane things. But
there's two things I'll pick up on there. Overseas, QAnon has gotten really big since our inaugural period. It's kind of suspect, but you are seeing QAnon pivot towards calling for attacks against vaccination sites, vaccination development. You've also seen some gun control conversations. Like it's almost like, hey, whatever the grievance of the moment is, we're going to latch onto that. And you have seen some instances of individuals overseas, maybe groups, commit some acts of violence. But I fully agree with what Andy said. It's not like an organized extremist group. And on the Antifa point, because I did see another comment where somebody was asking, like, why are we talking about the right-wing violent extremism, as our international partners call it? And that is mainly because of the statistics. Like there are more cases, there are more threats, there are more death coming from what we would call the white supremacist subcategory of racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism and anti-government extremism, primarily from the militia subsector. So from a national security perspective, you put your resources towards where you are having the biggest threat. Antifa, I believe, has had one murder or death in the last 20 years, and it was in Portland, kind of in a counter-protest moment this past summer. Whereas with violent white supremacy, we've seen, I want to say it's like in the last 10 years, 76% of all attacks have come from, lethal attacks have come from the white supremacist violent extremist ideology. And that's inclusive of international terrorism. So that's why you see so much more attention on that. It's not, sadly, it has become politicized, but it's really more data driven when you look at the data.
Yeah. Andy, we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to try to hit a few quick questions. This one has to do with the prosecutions of domestic terrorism, specifically the January 6th attacks. Kavan Nourouzi asks that now we're getting close to 3 months since the attacks, and some people in the media are already saying that the prosecution and charges from the attacks are taking too long. How do you respond to that? How do you respond that here we are with all of the cell phone footage and all of the TV footage and all of the people hundreds who have already had charges against them, that they still haven't produced charges against all of the people who were involved?
Well, it's been an enormous effort to date, and they have, I think, closing in on 400 people who've been charged so far, each one of whom had to be identified and located and then build a case against them from whole cloth. None of these people were, they weren't like people who were already under investigation who then showed up. So I don't think we can minimize, you shouldn't minimize the amount of work that's gone into it so far. I think what we've also seen is, it's kind of like the rings of a target, right? And you start with that outer ring. It's just identifying as many people as you can who are inside the Capitol, place they shouldn't have been, and therefore are guilty, or could be charged with fairly minimal offenses. Then you see them move in a ring to those groups like the Proud Boys and others who now we believe we can make maybe conspiracy cases against them. Now you're really zeroing into the center ring when you talk about the indictment that came out this week that actually alleges an agreement between two different groups, from the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, working together to incite violence on the Capitol. So the cases are getting more complicated, more evidence driven, much more time and effort intensive as we go. So you will see more of those and fewer of these big number cases, but they're not going to let it go. They are going to follow this out as far as they possibly can. I'm confident of that.
Final question for you, Elizabeth, and then we will wrap up. DHS, in theory, like any bureaucracy, has specialized functions. That is, FEMA can still deal with natural disaster recovery at the same time that INA is dealing with assessing threats to the US. But we all know that a bureaucracy's resources are directed, and especially senior leadership attention is directed where the current problem is. Do you see there being a problem in DHS because of the immense focus on immigration right now? Do you think that the secretary and the others in the executive offices are going to, in a sense, be distracted a bit from this domestic violent extremism issue because of the huge and rightfully pressing issues on immigration?
The last 4 years, that was definitely a huge problem. But the problem was coming from the fact that it was the president's only focus.
Yeah.
And he really didn't care about the rest of the mission of DHS. And so sadly, the secretary then had to, answer those multiple daily phone calls.
Yeah.
And it had the cascading effect of really impacting the ability of DHS being able to do much of consequence on a lot of different issue spaces.
Right.
We drove as much progress as we could, lacking some of that senior level attention. Today, it's a slightly different problem. They don't have anybody Senate confirmed except for Mayorkas. I mean, a lot of this gets so much better if they could get some people nominated and confirmed. DHS, and I would think DOJ and FBI are challenged with this as well, is suffering from 4 years of being beat up. A lot of people, good career civil servants, left because it was just too much to take. So there's this hollowed out lack of seasoned, experienced people. So it's really important to get seasoned, experienced people as political appointees, stabilize the ship, so to speak, and then start to build and repair what's broken. So that's the most important thing that they need to do, is get the people confirmed. The second thing, where I have a lot of tremendous comfort, is that the people that are in the prevention office, the people in my old counterterrorism office that does the policy mitigation side of counterterrorism, I know that they are working, around the clock on doing a 60-day sprint on domestic violent extremism. The White House is driving a similar effort. There's a lot of interesting ideas that are coming out. So I feel very confident that we have some good men and women working on the problem set, and will be able to advance some solutions that are being championed by people I've both worked with at DHS and then people I worked with in the previous decade. I think they have good, competent leadership in that space. But yes, we need Senate confirmed leadership at DHS throughout the organization to be able to deal with all of the mission.
You got it. Larry, over to you.
Well, that was a fantastic and, as I hoped for, very rich dialogue on a very complicated subject. Thank you very much, Andy. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think you both brought very interesting and unique perspectives to the problem. I particularly liked your focus, Elizabeth, on the human aspects of what's going on. So thank you very much for that. David, wonderful job moderating. Thank you again. This is his second attempt at moderating for the Hayden Center and passes with flying colors. So much so, we're going to give him a third opportunity. On April 15th, we're going to step away from some of the heavy subjects that we've been doing for quite some time. We're going to have an event that is going to focus on spy fiction. David will be engaged in a conversation with three authors, Brad Thor, who is quite famous and renowned for his Scott Harworth series of spy thrillers. Brad comes from outside of the intel community, writes this work from not having worked inside. But we will also have two authors who are former employees of the intelligence community, Karen Cleveland, a former CIA counterterrorism analyst, and Alma Katsu, who is a former CIA and NSA, National Security Agency analyst. All three of them have books either just out or about to come out. If you want to read their books between now and April 15th, Brad's most recent book was Near Dark, published last year. Karen's most recent book comes out in August called You Can Run, but she has a novel from last year called Keep You Close. And prior to that, Need to Know, which made the bestseller list. And then Alma has a book that just came out this week called Red Widow. It's her first spy thriller. She has had some great success at horror fiction. She wrote a book called The Deep, which looked at the Titanic from a sort of spooky aspect, and The Hunger, which looked at the Donner Party, which is macabre enough already, but she threw some ghosts in and made it very interesting. So please join us on April 15th, where we kind of unwind and relax and enjoy espionage a little bit. So with that, thank you again all, and I'll turn it over to Mark for final comments.
Great. Thank you, Larry. And I'll make it very brief. I think that was the perfect closing, actually. So my appreciation to all on the panel. It was a really great in-depth conversation. And to all in the audience who attended tonight, well over 250 people were here listening to this program. I know you got a lot out of it. And I know you can see these folks on programs on television, on the cable stations. We go deeper here for these longer conversations. I think it's extremely valuable. We're going to keep doing this. So Elizabeth Newman, you're new to the Schar School and the Hayden Center. Thank you so much for your participation. And maybe we need to talk to you a little bit more about getting you more engaged in our activities here. These other three gentlemen are already a part of our school. So thank you for everything you did for us tonight. So with that, let me give a final thank you and good night to all, and see you at the next Hayden Center program. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.